Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Jesus' fame is hard to explain. He never wrote a book, never led an army, never discovered a mountain or a country, yet he has had the greatest impact of any person in the history of the world. Today in Mark 3, we have 5 reactions to the real Jesus from people who actually met him. Which one will be most like you? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Well, friends, I think if we think about it, Jesus' fame is quite difficult to account for. He's not someone who ever wrote a book. He never led an army. He never discovered a mountain or a country. Yet Jesus has had one of the greatest impacts of any person in the history of the world. The author of this biography that we are working our way through, Mark, he's really interested to describe the impact that Jesus had through Jesus' response to people's responses to Jesus. And the last time we were looking at it, in chapter 3, verse 6, it got to something of a climax, where two groups that otherwise detested each other, the Pharisees and the Herodians, they found something that could unite them together as they began to plot how to kill Jesus. And Jesus seems to have been going out of his way to do things that would provoke a reaction like that. In our passage today, Mark describes 3 episodes. First, by the lake in verses 7 to 12, and then on a nearby mountain in verses 13 to 19, and then back in town in a house in verses 20 to 35. But the theme that runs through these 3 scenes is a reaction, actually 5 different reactions to Jesus and the impact that he is having. And what is important for us to do as we read, as we listen, is to try and understand the reactions of the different people in the different groups. These are people very much like you and me who are reacting to Jesus as they experience him. And as we see their responses, we find out that they reflect different responses to Jesus that we or our colleagues or our friends might have ourselves. The first group we encounter is a crowd by the sea in verses 7 to 12. Note where they've come from. Look again at verse 7. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee. Now that's the whole region in which this is happening, the north of Israel, and they are following. When they heard about what he was doing, many people came to him from Judea. Now that's the south. And Jerusalem, well, that's the capital of Israel in the south. Idumea, well, that's the region across, and the regions across the Jordan. Now that's the southeast of the country. And then he says, and around Tyre and Sidon, well, that's the northern region. See, Jesus is drawing a crowd from all over the whole country, and they are all coming to this little backwater area. Verse 9, because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him, to keep the people from crowding. The word there is actually crushing. Keep the crowd from crushing him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Now, you and I can understand that crowd, can't we? Have you ever been in a crowd at a concert or a sporting event? It can be amazing, it can be euphoric, it can carry your emotions, but it can get carried away with, especially if it looks like people won't get what they want. And crowds can quickly turn ugly. We might remember some riots in Dublin recently, and they surprise people because they're not expecting it, and then the crowd turns, and this crowd we're reading about in this account seems to be getting a bit like that. There's not much that's commendable about this crowd, but you can understand it, can't you? I mean, the attitude of this crowd persists today when people hear about Jesus and think, well, maybe he can meet my need. Maybe he can do for me what I want him to do for me. Maybe Jesus can fit into my agenda. But in this crowd, there is something that we are unlikely to have experienced. Verse 11. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. The rest of the crowd is ignorant of who Jesus is or his significance. But the forces of evil, they recognize Jesus. And in that crowd, they shout out, "You are the Son of God." What they're probably trying to do is get some kind of control over Jesus. The idea is that if you know someone's name, you know their identity, and then you have some kind of power over them. Alex and I sometimes enjoy watching some of those crime programs on television. And we were watching one, and there was, at a fairground was the scene, and a man walked up to a child in the fairground and used the child's name to call them, and the child went with them because that person knew their name. If someone gave you a phone call and asked for your mother's maiden name, you might be hesitant to give them that name because they might use it to gain power over your money. In this passage of Mark, the forces of evil who know who Jesus is, they try to exert some control over him. Or perhaps they're seeking to whip up a frenzy from knowing his identity without understanding what Jesus has actually come to do. But in the context of that, Jesus, with sovereign authority, silences them. Now, I think that kind of reaction does exist today. These unclean spirits who know who Jesus is, but they remain devoted to evil. Jesus' brother, James, he wrote a letter that is preserved in the New Testament for us to teach what kind of belief is going to save us. Jesus' brother James wrote this letter, and he said, just believing the facts isn't enough. He says, even demons believe, and they shudder. And that's what we see in this passage. The demons believe. They know beyond a shadow of a doubt who Jesus is, but they will not willingly submit to Jesus. They will not devote themselves to him. In fact, they will devote themselves to opposing him. And maybe you know people who are like that. People who know the details about Jesus. They might even accept who Jesus is, but they will not commit their lives to him. Well, from verse 13, the scene changes. Now, on the mountain, verse 13, Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. We're not told how Jesus gets away from that crowd and off the boat and up the mountain, but I think this is now a different day. It's an entirely different situation. It's a direct contrast, however, with the crowd. It's a contrast with the crowd who is ignorantly pressing to get what they want, but it's also a contrast with the evil knowingly opposing him. See, he, Jesus, on the mountain, calls to himself those he wants, and they come to him. Maybe that would remind us again of another mountain, like the feeding of the 5,000, reminding us of the Exodus. God meets on the mountain and calls a people to himself. Jesus withdraws and he calls those he wants, and, verse 14, he appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. Jesus calls 12 people, 12. Again, like at the mountain of Sinai in the Exodus, where there were 12 tribes gathered by God, here on a mountain, Jesus calls 12 to himself. The beginning of a people of God called by Jesus, God the Son himself. And their job is to be with Jesus. Their job is to be witnesses, to testify to what he said, and did, and to join in the work of driving out the evil one and his work in the world. And that's what we're reading here. Peter, one of his 12, named here, we're reading his memories, recorded by Mark, who wrote them down to preserve them for people just like us on this call. Peter did the job that Jesus called him to do. Well, here are three reactions to Jesus. There's the crowd, with their desire to have their needs met. There's the evil spirits who know who he is but will not submit to him, but he has the power to force them. And third, those he calls, those Jesus calls to be engaged in the work that he's come to do. Now we move to the house, verse 20, back into the town, and in this house we see three other reactions. First, from his family. Verse 20, Jesus entered the house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. See, Jesus wasn't fitting into normal family expectations. Can't you hear a mother's concern in this? He's just not eating properly. Something about how he's doing things is seen by the family as dangerous fanaticism. It's unbalanced. Notice how they are so different to the crowd. Jesus' family are not being self-centred. They are concerned for Jesus, it seems, or at least they're concerned for the family name. They're not crushing to get what they can from him. And they're also not like the evil spirits trying to control and oppose him. No, they're concerned for his well-being and for his own good. They want to take him home, but they are ignorant. Unlike the apostles, they are not responding to him. Instead, they are expecting him to respond to them. It's interesting to see that the reaction of Jesus' family is one that still exists today, isn't it? Perhaps a parent whose teenager is getting involved with Christian things and concerned that they might be getting a little bit too involved. Or a manager concerned that a committed Christian might be at odds with the corporate brand or the corporate guidelines. Of course, there is such a thing as mad fanaticism, but it's easy for people to confuse the real thing with mad fanaticism. Because the real thing is the realization that Jesus is what life is all about. Realizing that Jesus Christ really is at the centre of history. What he is doing in the world is what history is really all about. Realizing that people desperately need what he alone can give. For he is the one on earth with the authority to forgive sins. And when people, friends and family and colleagues are devoted to that reality, it's easy to look at them and think that they're mad. And it is, if Jesus is not who he claimed to be. People thought that about the Apostle Paul as well. He had a good life. He had, as an academic, rolled out in front of him. A job for life is what he had, with status and power in his community. And instead, he becomes dependent on other people's gifts for his life. He goes from town to town, getting beaten, being imprisoned, being thrown out all over the Roman world, risking his life to teach this message about Jesus. Think with me for a minute. If you had a child who had done well at university, and they were doing well in their career, and they decided that instead of following all of that, that they were going to throw it all away to be a full-time Christian worker. And it would be bad enough if they were going to an established church. But just imagine they weren't even doing that, and they were going to be missionaries where there isn't even a house provided for them or an income. I mean, isn't that a bit weird? Isn't that a bit odd? Isn't it a bit unbalanced to do something like that? Especially if what they had was a really promising career, if they could have been doing really well in the world. Friends, do you see that Jesus' family reaction is not a reaction we are unfamiliar with? It's actually a reaction that we can very easily understand. But before we get to hear more about the family, we meet another group. Do you see in chapter 3, verse 22 of Mark? And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem. Now these are the folk from the big city. These are the folk from the holy city, and these are the theological specialists. And they have come because the impact of Jesus is getting a bit worrying. And so the theologians from the temple have come down to check it out and to make their assessment. And in chapter 3, verse 22 of Mark, we see they say he's possessed by Beelzebul, by the prince of demons he's casting out demons. Their analysis of Jesus is, this is occult, have nothing to do with it. Look at Jesus' response to these elite religious leaders, these top theologians. Jesus called them over to him, and Jesus gives them, at this stage privately, what is perhaps the sternest and most frightening warnings we get in the whole Bible. But it's also one of the most wonderful statements regarding Jesus' purpose. It's one that we must not miss. Have a look at it with me. Jesus began to speak to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. You religious bigwigs from Jerusalem, you could not be more wrong or more stupid. Where did you learn your theology? You are seeing evil power being overthrown, and you are attributing that work to the power of evil. Can't you see what's happening? What you see right in front of you, says Jesus, is the preparation for the plundering of Satan's house. Now, I said at the beginning that we should be trying to understand the reactions in this section, the reactions of people. Can you understand the reaction of the teachers of the law to seeing something like this? Where people hear what the Bible teaches, what Jesus himself teaches, and they judge what Jesus says to be evil. Now, that is increasingly the attitude of Western society to authentic Christian belief and way of life. A great tragedy is that, just like we see here, some of the chief culprits of that kind of an attitude call themselves theologians and church leaders. They hold positions in religious institutions. Years and years ago, in my studies at the University of Sydney and studies at Trinity College Dublin and through the Church of Ireland Theological Institute, some of the teachers who I had reject what the Bible says, and some of them even called it evil. And they tried to stop people from teaching it. For example, the Bible's clear teaching on the purpose of sex, that it is reserved for marriage between one man and one woman for life. And they call that clear teaching of the Bible as phobic and unloving and, as ironically, as unchristian. There are some of these experts who've come from Jerusalem who meet Jesus, and they call Jesus evil. They say Jesus is doing the work of the devil. And to do that is not a trivial thing. Actually, to do that is the most serious thing in the universe. Look at verse 28. Jesus says to those people, "Truly I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin." The idea that there is something that you can do that is so evil that you can never be forgiven is terrifying. If this does not incite some level of terror in you, then you do not understand it. On the other hand, I have met some Christian people who are so terrified by this prospect that they cannot think past it, because they're worried that they have already committed this sin. Now, if you are a Christian person, and you may even have heard that passage for the first time, or you've heard it before, and you really are worried about it, then I need to say this to you, and you need to hear it. The fact that you are worried about this means that you have nothing to worry about, because it shows that you are really concerned about what God and what Jesus thinks. Look again at what Jesus says this unforgivable sin is. Look at verse 30. He said this because they were saying, he has an impure spirit. That is the unforgivable sin. If you see the work of God in Jesus and call that work evil, that is the sin that will not be forgiven. If you look at Jesus and his work and his death on the cross, and you persist in declaring that that is the work of evil, that is taking the clear work of God and the Holy Spirit and speaking against him. That is taking all of the work of God's Spirit recorded in the Old Testament and saying, that's not about Jesus. But notice with me that this terrifying statement of warning also contains a most wonderful and comforting hope for these teachers and for everyone. Did you see it in verse 28? Truly, I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter. Jesus has come to bring forgiveness of all you've ever done, no matter how bad. And the only thing that can prevent you from receiving it is looking at that forgiveness and rejecting it. Looking at the work of Jesus Christ and placing yourself so opposite him that you call his work, you call authentic Christianity, evil. And as we speak with clarity about the problem of sin and hell with other people, we must never do that without holding out the reason Jesus came: to bring forgiveness to the people lost in sin. That's really important to remember in our evangelism, in our outreach to our colleagues and our friends. That as we speak about the real danger of God's punishment, we do that in order to bring them the great news that that is not the end of the news. That the good news is that Jesus has come to bring forgiveness. Well, in verse 31, Jesus' family turn up. Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone to call him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Listen to Jesus' response. Verse 33, who are my mother and brothers? He asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him, almost certainly the 12, and he says, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. These are the ones he called and came to him. The ones who he called, they came to him, and he commissions them to do the work of speaking of him to others. The ones who do God's will. And this wonderful statement that this is the true family of Jesus Christ. When Alex and I moved to England about 20 years ago now, we found a place that did a really good Chinese takeaway. And I got to know the owner a bit, and he found out that I was Australian and I worked for the local church, and about my family back in Sydney and all that kind of thing. And he told me about being from Hong Kong and about his sister who travelled around everywhere, and wherever she went around the world she stayed with family. And I thought he was talking about how his parents and siblings were scattered all over the world. But he said, that's what you Christians call each other, isn't it? You call each other family. He was not a Christian himself, but he had grasped something that I find all too easy to forget. I mean, I barely know most of you. And yet we are family. because we believe in Jesus. We believe the testimony of the 12 who are seated around with Jesus. And if I call you brother, if I call you sister, it's never going to be a flippant thing. It is always going to be a joyful statement, an exceptional statement of the eternal reality of the relationship that we have together in Jesus Christ. And we are Jesus' family, scattered around the world at the moment. You are Jesus' family, scattered into your workplace. And you are the means by which your colleagues might hear the message of Jesus and be transformed from death to life. Dear friends, brothers, sisters, in this passage, we've looked at reactions of 5 groups of people to Jesus, the real Jesus, when they met him. There was the crowd, driven by ignorant self-interest, not really interested in who Jesus says he is and what he's come to do, but more interested in what Jesus might be able to do for them. Their primary question is, will he do what I want him to? There's the evil spirits, who know exactly who he is but continue to oppose him. There's the family, who conclude that he's mad, he's unbalanced, he's fanatical. There's the theologians, who judge him to be evil. And then there's the true family. The true family who hear his call and they come to him. The true family who have their sins forgiven. And the greatest thing we can do, friends, is to ensure that we are members of that family, whose sins are forgiven, and therefore his mother and his brothers and sisters of one another as well. And as members of his family, we carry the word in our mouths that can call others to be adopted into that same family. Oh, as we speak of Jesus, we will expect the same kind of reactions as the real Jesus had, won't we? We won't be surprised when people react to the message of Jesus in the same way as they rejected to Jesus himself. But if someone believes, they will be rescued from judgment to Christ's family. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.